Hello everyone and welcome to another live webinar from Findmypast. Today we're going to be talking about unlocking Roman Catholic records, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Brian Donovan, who is head of our Irish records collection on Findmypast and also the man instrumental for bringing us our new and exciting Catholic Heritage Archive, which was launched this past February. So, without further ado, I'm going to go, just before we start, go through some housekeeping for the actual webinar to make sure that you are getting the best from it. There's a Q&A box you will see on the left-hand side of your screen as we go through the webinar. If you have any questions, just pop them in there, and we have a team on hand to answer the questions. At the end of Brian's presentation, we'll also come back, and if we have time, he will answer some questions live over the actual presentation as well. If you're having any trouble with sound, just make sure that the widget at the bottom of your screen for the media player is selected, and make sure your volume is turned up all the way to the top, because the sound has been tested and it is definitely working. Resource-wise, on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll be able to click through to Findmypast. The 4 websites are there listed, as well as download a copy of the presentation slides. And just to mention as well, to stay tuned all the way to the end, because if you do, there's a very special offer we have for our webinar viewers today, and we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'll pass you on to Brian, and he's going to take you through the presentation.
Thank you, Niall, and thank you all for coming and joining me here to discuss this. Catholic records are an extraordinary resource which have been so inaccessible for such a long time. And what I'm hoping to do is to try and give you an overview of what we've been doing and why it's so exciting. We've started our work on Catholic records some time ago, and for those of you who've been paying attention, will have seen last year we actually launched a full indexation of all of the Catholic parish registers that have been microfilmed by the National Library. This is all the Irish ones. There were 10.6 million records we released then, over 7 million baptisms, 3 million marriages, and they dated all the way back to 1670. It included virtually the entire country. There are some bits and pieces of Ireland which have not yet been imaged or registers. And it covered all of the country as well, north and south. And without doubt, it's the most important resource we have for Irish genealogy, which predates 1901. So we were very excited by this, and our users were terribly excited by the release. It was very, very popular, one of the most popular record sets we've ever released. If you have used them, these are the microfilm images. Sometimes they're better than others, but again, they were a wonderful project that was carried out to try and protect all of these records. And so we had great fun in actually making these available by creating a comprehensive index. But of course, we then decided to do something even more. We decided to make them free forever on Findmypast. So I'm delighted to say that will stay in place forever. So when we came back from doing that project, we sort of started thinking about what we should do next. We got a little ambitious, is probably the best way to put it. For those of you who are not familiar with the St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, it's there on your left. And then there's the Cathedral in Philadelphia on your right. We started thinking about Catholic records elsewhere. And we established the Catholic Heritage Archive, which we've announced earlier this year. And you'll see a map here of the dioceses around the world that we've initiated the project with. Obviously, Ireland is completely completed now, or 97% completed on our work last year. And we're starting the project internationally, both in Scotland, England, and in the USA. And there's some examples of materials there. But why are we choosing the places that we're choosing to start with? Well, we're going to be digitizing and releasing the Archdiocese of Baltimore. And why is that? Well, it was the first ever diocese in North America. In fact, for a long time, it was the only Catholic diocese in North America. Every other diocese in North America has been peeled away or split off from it at some point or other. There's a nice picture there you have of the first bishop to all of America, which was the Diocese of Baltimore, John Carroll. No prizes for guessing which country his ancestors came from. The next diocese we chose to actually digitize was the Diocese of Philadelphia in the USA. And why was that? Well, Philadelphia is unusual. Pennsylvania was tolerant and popular with Catholics, largely speaking because of William Penn's religious toleration. Mass was first said there publicly in 1707, which is much earlier than anywhere else. it was very difficult for Catholics in general in the USA through much of that early history. They were generally reviled and treated to a great deal of discrimination in most parts of the country. For example, the third archdiocese in the U.S. that we're digitizing records from is New York. And of course, New York has just about the largest Catholic population of any diocese in America today. I think it's second only to Los Angeles. But their Catholic churches were built going back to 1786. But when they built their first church, and you can see an example on that image in front of you of St. Peter's, which was the first church built in New York, that had to be built outside the city walls because of opposition to Catholicism. And of course, the situation was even more extreme in Britain. We started our project in Britain with two archdioceses, Birmingham and Westminster. You'll see Westminster Cathedral there on your right-hand side, which is one of the most architecturally stunning buildings you'll see in London. But at the time that was built, the whole relaxation which allowed the Catholic Church in Britain to establish dioceses all over the country was treated as a latter-day Guy Fawkes. In other words, another fifth column internally within England to bring the state down. You can see a cartoon of the sort of bigotry that was experienced at that time there in front of you. What I want to try and do here is give you a little bit of the hidden history of Catholicism in Britain and America, because it's not well understood by most people carrying out history or family history either. And I'm hoping that we can actually you get a better understanding of why it's so difficult to actually track these records and why they're so useful, and also the fact that the story that we've generally heard about the origins of the population of these countries isn't necessarily true. So, we all know how important immigration has been in U.S. history. The image in front of you is a typical example of New York. We can see Castle Garden there, and of the immigration of thousands and thousands and thousands of European migrants. Another image in front of you will show you Castle Garden in 1871. Now, Castle Garden was packed at this point with mostly Irish immigrants when they're reaching their peak in migration. And the image on your right-hand side is the typical image of those immigrants leaving their home country. In that case, it's from Queenstown in Cork in Ireland. But migration is only part of the story. Every country develops its own narrative of its origins, and the U.S. is no different from this. The image you see in front of you is a typical image of the origin story of the U.S. Pilgrim Fathers, pilgrims arriving and settling a land which was at that point occupied only by Native Americans. And they occupied in a statement of peace and harmony. And this is the official view. But how true is it? Well, the truth is that official narratives are full of dangerous assumptions. And the history of Roman Catholicism in America is no different. Yes, the Pilgrims did make America their home. They played a principal role in New England. Certainly, lots of other dissenting religions were very prominent in the early America, colonial America. But that is not the full story by any means at all. The first Europeans in the Americas were Catholic. They were Spanish, Portuguese, French. But they developed outside of the 13 English colonies. And so, therefore, they were largely written out of the history of America as it developed in the 19th and 20th century. Also, the establishment inside the 13 colonies didn't trust Catholicism at all, and sometimes for very good reason. So their role in the settlement history of America was minimized, officially minimized in most school programs as well. But the huge growth of Irish migration, Italian migration, German, Polish, and the U.S. expansion into Louisiana and the Spanish territory really just trying to change the entire character of settlement in America. It also should be said that there were Catholics from England, from Britain, from Scotland and Ireland there in the colonies from the earliest years. And what I'd like to do is give you a little overview, because I can't give you an overview of the entire history of the U.S., but I want to just touch on a couple of things. One is there's a couple of images in front of you now which will show you some of the not-so-hidden, darker undercurrent to the story. And this is St. Augustine Church being burnt down during a series of anti-Catholic riots in Philadelphia in 1844. Now, I'd said before that Pennsylvania was a tolerant, open-minded state in the earlier history, which has allowed Catholics to worship freely, unlike most of the other of the 13 colonies, which didn't allow that to happen. But even by 1844, even at a time when there was a very large Catholic population in America from all sorts of origins, the degree of anti-Catholicism was so extreme that it could actually lead to widespread death and destruction and injury, like is shown here. Now, I can't give a history of all of America and its experiences, so I'm going to treat one example to try and basically underline some of the points that I'm trying to make here. This is a little story of the island of Amherst Island, which most of you will never have heard of. Amherst Island is an island in Lake Ontario, just on the border between Canada and the U.S. And it was, this map here you can see is from 1878, and it shows you all the plots of land for the people who settled there. There weren't very many, a few hundred families who settled on the island. And it was settled by a very well-known figure at the time, Sir John Johnson. Now, few of you will know who he was, but his father was exceptionally well-known, Sir William Johnson. He was one of the great pre-revolutionary generals in the American colonies, better known as the Mohawk Baron. He negotiated most of the major deals with the Mohawk community. And when Amherst Island was settled, it was settled by Presbyterians coming from East Ulster in Ireland. And you can see an example here of the image in front of you of the major Presbyterian church on the island. And that is the official history. This general and these Ulster Presbyterians came to settle the island and make it their own, the first settlers who were ever there. But how true is that? I went to go and visit the island a couple of years ago and decided to have a hunt around. It's not big. And lo and behold, on 1/3 of the island, the eastern third of the island, with the poorest land, I discovered the local Catholic Church. You'll see a picture there on the left-hand side of my youngest son, who joined me at the time. The entire family were there. And it was interesting because there was no mention of the fact that these people were there at all, but we discovered the entire eastern third of the island were settled by Irish Catholics who came with the Presbyterians, largely to provide farm labourers and other support. You'll see an image in front of you of a headstone for the McKenty family. These were Irish Catholics. They were also actually quite conscious loyalists as well. They had actually consciously chosen to go to Canada. But, you know, the underlying truth to this story is even more dramatic than you might think, than simply a third of the population coming to the island being Catholic as opposed to Presbyterian, which was the official view. The picture there on your right-hand side is of that gentleman, Sir William Johnson, I mentioned earlier, who was the Mohawk Baron. Well, you might not realize it, but when he arrived in the Americas, he was also Catholic, despite being one of the leading pre-revolutionary generals. He was also the grandson of Liam McShane O'Neill, who was one of the O'Neills of the Fews in Ulster. Now, they were one of the great Gaelic princely families who were defeated by the English colonization of Ireland. And you must question and wonder whether his own family experience must have played a significant role in his discussions with the Mohawk when he was there, talking to them about what was likely to happen to them if they didn't do what he was suggesting. So it changes the coloration quite a bit. Let's have a look at Britain. Well, we all know that Britain, England, I should say, separated from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, and the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, became the official established religion from that point forward. Well, many of you will also know about the penal laws that were brought in at different points from the 16th century onwards, which actually slowly but surely restricted Catholics from owning land. They couldn't own land, they couldn't have a profession, they couldn't be MPs, or they couldn't, in other words, they couldn't be elected officials, they couldn't, in many cases, vote in elections. They had a huge amount of restrictions on what they could do. And most people, as in Ireland, made the intelligent decision to actually just, if it's going to be so difficult to be that religion, we might as well just give up on it and do something else. So the penal laws are pretty extreme. And they started being relaxed very slowly from about 1770s onwards. The Catholic Relief Act was brought in 1778 to finally allow Catholics to own property and to inherit land and join the army. But even that small change led to the Gordon riots in London, which were extreme, which I'll discuss those in a moment. And it was only finally in 1829 that the Catholic Emancipation Act actually allowed Catholics to both vote and stand in elections. So what I'm trying to say here is that there's a long history of the final easing of the restrictions on Catholics long before any sort of mass migration of Irish Catholics comes in to the country. And the map in front of you shows you the percentage of Catholics in England in the middle of the 18th century, in the 1700s, actually quite early in 1720. And you'll notice that up to a quarter and more of the population in the north of the country are Catholic. They're that early anyway. And that never changes. So there's always a sizable minority in England who never conformed to the established church and stayed with the Roman Catholic Church. Then, of course, in the 1840s, mass Irish migration commences, and that plays a phenomenal role. And then in 1850, finally, the dioceses are re-established right across England, which they hadn't operated there since the Reformation. Here are some images which will cover a little bit of the story. The Gordon riots I mentioned beforehand in 1780. There's an image above, a painting derived from that, which was an extreme anti-Catholic mob went around killing people who were Catholic. But of course, that history of anti-Catholicism in Britain has a long roots. I mean, the image below is Guy Fawkes, who famously, in his own cabal, tried to blow up Parliament in the early 17th century. Or you've got the image on the right-hand side of what happened to those who were involved in helping hide priests in England. So it was extremely difficult for English people to actually retain their connection to the Catholic Church through this period. In fact, it should be noted that it was easier to be Catholic in Ireland than it was in England, and many English Catholics migrated to Ireland because of that. So let's get on to the records, which is probably why most of you are actually listening to this talk in the first place, but I just felt it was important to give you some background. Why have Catholic records been so inaccessible for so long? Well, there's a number of very basic reasons. The first one, and the most important, is that Catholic records are private records and they're sacraments. And a sacrament is a private act between a person and their God. Now, in this sort of latter-day, rather more secular age, we probably may poo-poo that to a certain extent, but you've got to understand that this is real, it's genuine, and it matters to people both in the past and today. And the Catholic Church takes their role very, very seriously. In fact, they have a whole sequence of laws known as the canon laws, which cover just about everything you could ever think of within life in general, not just the church and church activity. And they have a very strong commitment to privacy. Canon law number 220 states that nobody is permitted to harm the good reputation which a person possesses or injure the right of a person to protect his or her own privacy. Now, this is understood to relate to all their records as well. So arguably, you could say that, in fact, actually, privacy is not just a matter for somebody's life. I mean, the Catholic Church, like all religions, believes in life eternal, so privacy may actually be in place forever. So many Catholic dioceses at this point today are of that opinion. They should be private forever. So when we're saying we're releasing records, it wasn't done, it's not an easy process to convince often. There's also other reasons, more mundane reasons, why the Catholic Church itself is a little bit slow to release these records. The records themselves represent attitudes of a time. So when a child was illegitimate, that would be noted in the margin of a register. Those sorts of issues wouldn't matter today really at all, but they did in the past. And of course, there's an understanding today that it's rather embarrassing that they were actually noting these things. But, you know, this really says more about social attitudes at the time rather than religious views. There are also practical reasons which make them difficult. Roman Catholic parish registers are generally kept in Latin. That was the official language of the church. And when they aren't in Latin, they tend to be in other languages which won't be familiar to those who are English-speaking, in Polish or Italian or German or so on. And it can be very difficult to use them. But even more fundamentally, there's been a difficulty in getting access to them because nobody's been able to copy the records. And this was underlined by the Church in 2008 when a letter was sent from the Congregatio Pro Clericus, which is a body which is designed to give instructions to priests of what they can do and what they can't do. And they sent a letter to all priests around the world telling them not to participate with any microfilming efforts by the Mormon Church. So the Mormons who had actually managed, through family search, had managed to image a number of Catholic dioceses in the U.S. and elsewhere, not very many, but a number, their activity stopped overnight. So this is one of the many reasons why it's been difficult to access them. So why are the records so important? Well, all sacramental records from any denomination are important because they are fundamentally records of births, of marriages, and of deaths, which are three of the key records that we ever keep, or ever will look for when we're actually building a family history. So what records are there? Well, there's baptisms, marriages, confirmations, catechisms, census records. Yes, census records. I'll show you those in a moment. Congregational lists, and so on. But there's a lot of rules. I mean, the Catholic Church have been building up a body of bureaucratic rules for centuries. And they have a number of canons, those canon laws I mentioned before, which deal with this, stipulating exactly how records are to be kept. For example, in baptisms, the pastor of the place where the baptism is celebrated must carefully and without any delay record in the baptismal register the names of the baptized, the mention made of the minister, parents, sponsors, witnesses, if any, the place and date and place of birth, and so on. It goes on to say that if it concerns a child born to unmarried mother, the name of the mother must be inserted if her maternity is established publicly or she seeks it willingly in writing or before two witnesses. Moreover, the name of the father must be inscribed if a public document of his own declaration before the pastor and two witnesses proves his paternity. You know, it's very specific about what they have to include and what they shouldn't include. And then it gets even more complicated, because of the certain local traditions that are in play in different dioceses, which vary from place to place quite a lot. And then the Natemere, which is a papal decree, comes in 1907. Now, Natemere is really interesting because it plays a huge role in the development of Catholicism, both in Ireland and internationally. But it required that lots of details were taken about people who were getting married to prove they were indeed Catholic. It required that couples, whether they were both Catholic or not, must bring up their children as Catholics. So there's quite a lot of information is transcribed or added to the register because of this. And I'm going to show you some examples now. You have before you a title page of a baptismal register from Birmingham from the 1870s. Let's go and have a look and see what these records look like. Well, here's an English language baptismal register from Philadelphia in 1903. And it has the date of the birth of the child and the name of the child, the names of the parents, the date of baptism, the sponsors or witnesses to the baptism, and the names of the officiating priest. Now, again, that's in English, so it makes things nice and easy, but that's relatively unusual. Most records are in Latin. And this is another one from Philadelphia in 1846. And you're probably groaning inwardly now, going, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to have to try and deal with a Latin language." It's not that difficult, and I want to show you how it's not that difficult. Here is that 1846 baptismal register for Philadelphia. And what do we have in front of us? Die 15 Octoberus, well, that's the 15th of October. Birgitta, Bridget. Filia Johannes et Margarita, which is the daughter of John and Margaret. Kerry. Nata, 7 wages. Basically, she was born on the 7th day of the same month. And it goes on to tell you the name of the sponsors, which are Eduardo and Maria Fagan. So you can read that fairly easily. It's not terribly complicated. Here's another example of baptisms. This is from 1883, and it gives the places of origins of the parents. I know, you can't read it because it's just much too small an image on your screen. So let's actually go and underline some of the bits here. Now, it's too small, so we'll zoom in a bit here and we'll show you better. You'll notice in the first entry, the parents are from Hibernia. They're from Ireland. The next entry, they're from Scotland. And did you notice that I've circled there in red the second entry? It's got illegit on the side. That child there is illegitimate. In other words, his parents are not married, and which is considered so important. And is a point still of some embarrassment by the church today that they recorded such things. Now, you also find out a little bit more about, after Natemere comes in, they start keeping records beyond simply the baptism. They keep records of what happened thereafter. So in this sheet here you have in front of you, this register, the last column on the right-hand side is a note of the marriage of that person who was baptized. Let's zoom in and have a look at them, because they're fascinating. This is the first person was married to Henry Helmstead in St. James's, Philadelphia, on August the 12th, 1910. Next person married Leo Burkhardt on October 20th, 1920 in St. Francis in Philadelphia, and so on. So because of Natemere coming in, they had to make sure that they actually identified that a person was baptized and kept a record of their marriage. So suddenly a baptismal register becomes a much, much bigger document. Here's a marriage register from 1778 from Philadelphia. Again, it's in Latin, and if we zoom in, you'll see it's not difficult to actually read these. You actually get the names of the parties getting married, the date that it happened. You get information often about their parents and who the priest was who's marrying them and the witnesses. Here's a confirmation register. This confirmation register is from Westminster. And it shows you all of the children, 12, 13 usually at confirmation, who are actually confirming their religious faith. And it's that set of records which you normally don't easily find but survive exceptionally well for the Catholic Church. Here's a catechism. Catechisms are people who are swearing their allegiance to the doctrines of the Church. Oftentimes, this can be in advance of them actually undergoing adult baptisms or preparing themselves to marry somebody who is Catholic and they themselves are in the process of converting. They survive in numbers, particularly in Birmingham and Westminster in England. Here's a congregational list from Birmingham in 1770, Easter 1770 in Britain. And it lists everybody who's attached to the church in that particular parish and who's attending. Wonderful details about those people, details about when they were born, when they die, and so on. Even more exciting, we actually have the priest's notebooks that he uses during Mass. Now, these Mass books are fantastic because they give you a really great insight into the workings of a community at a time. This one's from 1897 in Birmingham. And if you look at it, they start out by listing off the Masses that are being held for the dead, each of the days during the week. It tells you who's sick in the community. You can see Clara Heitzman on the right-hand side. She's sick. Who's recently died, Elizabeth Buxton. The anniversaries of people's deaths are there. And it'll go on to other local community news and activities, not all relating to people who've died, but other issues. And you can see there's notice there of banns that are being read for people who are intending to get married. So this information is wonderful. We've indexed everything from this material and made it available online. And I mentioned census records beforehand. Well, if you're looking at any ancestors who are in the Diocese of Westminster, which of course is the northern part of London, you'll be delighted to know that in 1893 they carried out a full census of all members of the church. And it's quite detailed. For example, you get the names, you get the ages of children, you get all the details about their attendance at church and how regularly they attend, and then lots of interesting gossipy notes by the priests involved in gathering the information, which is half the fun, to be honest with you. You'll notice here one person's listed as a good Catholic. Another person, they just say he's left school and got no work. And there's a group of children there they're called very wild and ruly savages. And the one below it I quite like. Good widow, at the very bottom, bad Catholic with good Protestant wife. I mean, there's an ecumenicism in the treatment of this, which isn't entirely just biased to one faith or another. Now, I want to have a look through some of these records, go through a journey through them to see how they can be useful for building your family history, particularly for those of you who are trying to make the link from North America to Ireland, which I think is a big role these records can play in helping. Here is a set of marriage records, and remember how detailed I said these things were and how useful they could be in bringing you back. Well, if you look at the first one we have here, we have Edward Conway, who marries Margaret McNeve on the 29th of March, 1910, at the Most Precious Blood of Our Lord Parish in Philadelphia. But it tells you an awful lot more than that. It tells you exactly where and when they got baptized in Ireland. You'll see Edward Conway, and he's baptized in Cork in 1880, and Margaret McNeve is baptized in Roscommon in 1880. And better yet, they tell you the names of their parents. So Edward's parents are Michael Conway and Bridget Regan. And again, the next entry below it is the same. It tells you where they were born in Ireland, when they were born in Ireland, and the names of their parents. Isn't that brilliant? Now, what can you do with that? Well, let's just take Edward Conway. We know that he was baptized in Ireland. Let's go and have a look at the Irish parish registers, which we now have all online. And here we go. We find him. He's at the bottom of that page in front of you. There's Edward baptized on 5th of June, 1877 at Annakissy Parish in County Cork. And you'll notice just above it, it tells you that he married Margaret McNeve in Philadelphia, because the priests are talking to each other, because they're trying to confirm the details are correct to fulfill the rules of Natemere. Here's another example of a marriage. At the bottom of your page, you'll see a marriage of Mary Lawrence and James McElroy on the 30th of June, 1909, at the Church of Our Mother of Sorrows in Philadelphia. There it is in more detail. And again, it gives you the same sorts of details, where they're from, what date they were born. And we can now take that information and jump into the Irish Catholic parish registers and go and link it back. And here we can find that Mary was baptised in Mullinahone, County Tipperary, on the 27th of July, 1880, and that's on the Irish parish registers, which I said before is free on Findmypast. And again, if we zoom in and have a look at that entry, difficult to read, I know, but that some of these records can be quite hard to read, which is why our transcripts are so important that we get them right. You'll notice over the entry of her baptism, it states that she got married to James McElroy in Philadelphia. Again, the priests are talking to each other right across from Ireland to the USA in that time. So they're checking, making sure the figures are right. And of course, they're not just Irish. I should stress that. The Irish made up a big chunk of the Catholic population in the US. But they weren't the only. There was the Germans. A huge percentage of Catholics were German, Polish, Italian. So here's a German register. And here we have Polish. The Polish records tend to be in the Polish language as well, which makes them a little bit more challenging unless you're fortunate enough to have that skill. But again, the Polish registers are incredibly detailed. I have to say the Polish registers, I think, are probably the most detailed that I've come across so far. And the Lithuanian, Italian. I mean, they come from all over the world, as you know. So let's move on to what we're releasing at the moment, because we're coming to the end of my talk here today, but I wanted to give you an overview of where we're at and what we're planning to do soon. We can't tell you everything. It's pretty exciting stuff, I have to say, but this is one of the biggest projects that we've been involved with as a business. And if we told you everything that we're going to do, I think our competitors would really would have a seizure. But anyway, let's have a sneak peek of what we're doing this year. All of our work in Birmingham Archdiocese in Britain is complete, and we're working steadily through Westminster Archdiocese. We've had to go out to every single parish and gather their registers and bring them together to actually go and mark or to scan them. They've never been imaged before, which is wonderful in Westminster. So we hope to have it finished by the end of the summer. We're starting Liverpool Archdiocese at the moment, and they should be available online later this year. And we're the same. We're dealing with all of the Scottish dioceses, archdioceses and dioceses. And we've had first records have been released already, and we'll have the rest out later this year, possibly seeping into the beginning of 2018. In the US, well, Philadelphia Archdiocese is well underway. We've got about 60% of the records up so far. You've got to remember we can only release records if they're 100 years old or more. But we've got a bunch more still to do, and we hope to have them out early this summer. New York, where we've started work on, it's a big, big job because all of those records we're pulling in from the parishes and hoping to get them out. That we'll start seeing New York material coming online probably in September, October, I expect. Baltimore Archdiocese in the US, that'll be again later this year. And there's many, many more in development as well. There's lots more to keep you excited. So, I've come to the end of my overview. I know it's been relatively rushed, but I hope we've given you a good understanding of why the records are so important, why we're so excited by this project, and why we're hoping that you will as well be excited by it. And I suppose to help support your interest and get you to go and try this stuff out at least, we're giving a special webinar offer today, which is a 50% off a 1-month world subscription. That's access to over billions and billions of records that we have from all over the world. The discount code there in front of you is CHA50, and it expires on the 24th of April. So make sure you actually grab the opportunity as quick as you can. I'll be staying here to answer some questions in a moment, so I'm going to hand you back to Niall, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Brian. I hope you all found that very interesting and informative. I know I did. We'll run through some questions. There have been questions flying in, and the team are trying to get through as many as possible. But I will ask some of them to Brian now to get the answers to the questions live. The first one, Brian, comes in from Vicky Stockham, and Vicky has asked, did female baptismal sponsors sometimes use their maiden names instead of married names in the registers?
Generally speaking, women tended to, in the past, always use their married names. It would be kind of unusual for them to use a maiden name. And that's really a social convention of its time. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just will be pretty unusual.
Thank you. The next one in is from Susan Bully, and Susan says, how can we access Catholic birth records from Antrim around 1840 and earlier? She's trying to find some elusive ancestors, so she's interested in Catholic birth records for Antrim.
Well, that's a nice, easy one, I'm delighted to say. All the Irish Catholic records which were on microfilm in the National Library are all available on Findmypast, fully indexed, including all of County Antrim. Now, when I say all, it's 97%, so it's pretty much all. There are some pockets here and there which are missing, but it's I think you'll be able to cover most of your requirements with what we have there online at the moment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brian. Another question in from Kathleen Klein. And Kathleen asks, my main interest is in records from Philadelphia, which are obviously ones that we added a few months ago, so that should be useful for you. But she's asking specifically, will you digitize only certain years of the Catholic Standard and Times or the complete? And also, as each year comes into your 100-year cutoff, will you be adding that particular year to your database?
The simple answer is yes. The agreement we have varies from one diocese to another. They're not all universally the same systems we're following, because of course every diocese has its own regulations which are separate from others. But generally speaking, as each 100 years as each year rolls forward, we can release another year's worth of records. In relation to the diocesan newspapers, we've been doing a few diocesan newspapers. They're really interesting as a resource for community information, community activity, because the Catholic community in many American dioceses use that newspaper as a way of communicating with each other and also trying to locate relatives and friends. And we're digitizing all the Catholic diocesan newspapers when we're dealing with the records from that diocese. So in the case of Philadelphia, we're going to be covering a great deal more than simply what is covered by the 100-year rule. We're going to be covering a longer period of time, certainly up to the Second World War.
Okay, another question in here from Marianne Sickman, and Marianne is asking, my family comes from County Clare, but I have been unable to find records beyond my great-grandfather and who I believe was my great-grandmother. Is there anything special specifically about County Clare records that might be causing me from moving forward?
Not really. I mean, I'm assuming, given what you've been mentioning, you're going to be needing to look at civil registration even more so than religious records. I mean, civil registration for Ireland goes back to 1864 for all marriages, births and deaths. So I would imagine you should be able to actually look at we have the index for it available on our site. You should try that out. Otherwise, I would hope that you've actually tried using the Catholic Parish Registers, which can be very, very useful as well for Clare. But there's nothing specific about Clare that makes any difference from anywhere else, unless you're exceptionally unlucky and the actual parish you're looking at doesn't have records predating, sort of 1860 or so on. And there's a few parishes which don't have records predating that. Most parish records go back to the 1820s, and some parishes go back earlier, particularly urban parishes go back earlier.
Thank you, Brian. Another question in here from Sue Lindhorst. Sue is asking, what percentage of Irish Catholic Church records originally created would you estimate that you've discovered? So I guess what she's saying here is, of the church records that we have online, is that the full coverage of everything that is available?
That's a big question. I mean, how much was ever created in the first place? Well, the truth is that for long periods of time, the Catholic Church had a semi-clandestine existence in Ireland. I mean, it was tolerated legally, tolerated by the government because it couldn't do anything other than that. But as a consequence, record keeping was never perfect, and record keeping only starts to become systematized within the Catholic Church in Ireland from the 1830s. So it's relatively late. Having said that, I would suspect that possibly up to a half of Catholic records were ever created here don't survive. And that has much to do with climatic conditions. I mean, Ireland's a very damp environment, which is just the worst type of environment for paper. So they tend to disintegrate through mold and mold spores and just general damp conditions. But having said that, once you're looking at a date from 1830-40 onwards, most parish registers survive. And the majority go back to 1820, and quite a significant number go back as far as 1800. It's the earliest stuff prior to that which doesn't survive so well. And the same is the case for the other denominations, because bear in mind that in the 1841 census in Ireland, 37.5% of the population weren't Catholic. So you've got to remember that, the penal laws had an impact. People changed religion as a consequence of the penal laws, or they may never have been, they may have been that religion for their own reasons themselves. So always look beyond any one denomination when you're doing your family history research in Ireland.
Thanks, Brian. A question in from Mary Weston, which is quite a common question that people have, especially when it comes to Irish research. Do you have to know the parish in order to be able to search? And because Mary only has the town name.
Well, if you have the town name, we can find out the parish pretty quick from that. Most Catholic parishes actually will be named after the major village or town and the surrounding area around it. So you should have no difficulty finding it. You can, if you go for a search on our site, Findmypast at the Catholic Parish Registers, and actually look under the name that you're of the place you're looking for, you should be able to find it. At least of the county, you should be able to break it down further than that.
Okay, moving away from Ireland to the US now. Margaret Donnelly is asking about the upcoming New York records. And are they the records from the Archdiocese of New York City, or are they from upstate New York?
Well, they cover the Diocese of New York itself, which is an archdiocese, you're right. But that covers New York City except for Queens and Brooklyn, which form their own diocese of Brooklyn. But it also covers a chunk of New York State as well. And I want to try, my geography in the U.S. isn't brilliant, so I'm going to try and see if I can actually get the area for you. But it goes out beyond Yonkers and a little bit further into upstate New York, but not a huge distance. If you are ever concerned about what the boundaries are of dioceses, I would recommend going to Wikipedia and looking under Catholic diocese there. There's a wonderful map and list of them, and they give you pretty clear depictions of the areas. But the Catholic Archdiocese in New York encompasses the boroughs of Manhattan, the Bronx, Staten Island, and the counties of, it's almost here in front of me, counties of Dutchess, Orange, Putnam, Rockland, Sullivan, Ulster, and Westchester. There you go.
Thank you very much, Brian. Question in from Gillian Beck, just regarding the number of Latin records that we find in the Catholic Heritage Archive over and over again. Will the Latin records be translated into English?
Well, we're fully transcribing them and basically indexing them by all personal names, place names. But the actual content of most of these records, the structure of them, whilst it may be in Latin, it's actually relatively easy to follow. There's rarely do you have any commentary in there which you would need to translate beyond what we've done for you already. Moreover, we've also developed a alternate forename search interface. So in other words, if you go to our search interface and you include the word John as a forename, it will automatically look for the Latin Johannes. And so on with any other forename you can think of. So we've tried to cover any of the eventualities you might have with difficulties with Latin.
Thank you very much, Brian. Next question is in from Jean Berry. And Jean Berry is moving into the UK records now and wondering if the Liverpool records also include anything outside the outlying areas, such as Widnes, which obviously comes under Lancashire. So she's wondering exactly the coverage about the Liverpool Catholic records.
I will now have to go and hunt very quickly online to see if I can get an answer for you. But as far as I'm aware, it covers, it's mostly the actual city of Liverpool, what is now within the official county of Merseyside. But I'll see if I can get you something more precise than that. Again, if you're ever unsure, I would aim you directly across to Wikipedia, which actually manages to gather this information very well. It is quite, it's not as clear as I'd like it to be to make it easy to answer in this Q&A. So I'd send you, if you don't mind, off to it covers south of the Ribble, parts of Merseyside, Cheshire, Greater Manchester, and the Isle of Man. Is the area of the Diocese of Liverpool. So it's quite an extensive area, but it's mostly, as I said, what you would normally refer to as the official county of Merseyside, plus the Isle of Man.
Lovely, thank you, Brian. This is what we like to see. We're catching them out on some of the questions. We have a question in from Anne Sweeney here, and it's staying with Liverpool for the moment, actually, and she's wondering if her great-grandfather taught in a Catholic school in Liverpool. So is there any place where the church keeps records of teachers?
Well, the teachers were paid, remember, by state authority through the National Education Service, but the church does retain a lot of the registers for the schools. Now, we aren't dealing with those records in this particular project, but we will be doing some of them. Actually, in the case of Liverpool, we'll be doing quite a few of them, and now that I remember. Those records are actually kept by the archives, the Liverpool Library and Archives. So you'll get a chance to see that material when we release the Liverpool collection. It'll come out in stages, so that won't be the first part of what we release. But in general, with the Catholic Church, they usually retain all of their school registers and also the school administration registers as well.
Thank you, Brian. Just quickly checking on the time. We have about 15 minutes left, so we still do have time to get through a good few questions, so keep them coming in. The next one here, Brian, is from Laurie Ware, and Laurie wants to know sponsors for baptisms and witnesses for marriage. Were they usually related to the child or the couple?
They're often related, but there's no standard system about it. Most typically, you'll find that it'll be siblings of people who are marrying will act as witnesses to a marriage. And it could be any other family members who could act as sponsors to a baptism. That, of course, breaks down a bit when people are migrating and you see the Irish, for example, moving into Britain or moving into America, or any other nationality for that matter moving around. It's just as likely to be friends, people they've got to know, people who happen to be nearby, whoever they saw in the church when they decided to actually arrive. You know, it's not necessarily anybody else, but more often than not, they tend to be family.
Lovely, thank you, Brian. The next one is from Donna Fitzgerald, and Donna is asking, would there be information on the genealogy of Irish Catholics who became priests or monsignors anywhere online? Not online, no, but I will promise you that actually, if you can identify the diocese they were attached to, there'll be lots of information about them within the diocesan archives. Under canon law, every diocese needs to have an archive. Now, that's all well and good, you know, but in practice, most dioceses don't really have a lot of funds to throw out developing an archive, so they usually have a part-time archivist who's often a retired religious figure within the diocese, a nun or a retired priest, and they look after it part-time. But they're often more interested in dealing with queries around members of the clergy than they are for the usual genealogical questions, as you can imagine. Thank you very much, Brian. This one is in from David Luke. I think you might have touched on this already, but we'll get a direct answer to it anyway. Is Manchester in the Liverpool Archdiocese the area that covers the records? Most of Manchester is covered by the Diocese of Salford, which is different from Liverpool. There's bits of outlying Manchester which are part of the Diocese of Liverpool. So if you want to actually try and find out the records for the Diocese of Salford, what I would recommend is you get in touch with the archives of the Diocese of Salford, because they're doing a project with a couple of local societies to try and index some of their material. So hopefully you'll have a chance to actually follow that up through them. Okay, another question in from Francis Bow, and Francis is asking, was it common in the past in Ireland for grandparents to be godparents? Actually, that's relatively unusual in my experience. It tends to be not grandparents. It tended to be more people of the same generation as the parents themselves who are acting as sponsors, because the whole point of being godparents or sponsors is to be able to step in to rear the child should the parents die. So they play an important role, also a spiritual role as well. They're supposed to actually guarantee that the child is brought up in the Catholic faith, but they have other responsibilities beyond that. Thanks, Brian. Bill MacDougall is asking, if all you have is the county, i.e. Cork or Limerick, where might you look? Well, if you're looking at Catholic records, you just need to look at the individual parishes that exist within that county. But if you just go to Findmypast, you can choose the county. You can limit your search by county.
And this will actually do all the work of determining which diocese that relates to as well itself and which parishes.
Thank you, Brian. I have a question in from Sarah Massey, and it's actually the same question as we had about Liverpool or Manchester being covered by the Liverpool records. So I'll jump onto the next one because that one's already been answered. Catherine Spry has asked, if I'm trying to locate records for a US parish which no longer exists, who would I contact?
Well, what you need to know is which diocese it is in now, that area. And once you know which diocese it's in now, you contact their diocesan archives and ask them. Because they should, if it's been closed, they should have actually transferred all registers to the diocesan archives. Now, it's also possible that it was amalgamated with another parish, in which case those parish registers would have been moved to the superseding parish for them to look after. But it's the diocesan archive should be able to tell you that. If there isn't a diocesan archivist or you can't get through to one, contact the diocesan chancellor because they're the person who will be the archivist boss. For a lot of the smaller dioceses, that's the only way to go about it. The archdioceses tend to have more functional archives in place.
Thank you, Brian. Another question is in from Lois Farley Shufford, and Lois is asking, when there is a gap in parish records, because the church was burned, as she was told, were those records duplicated anywhere else? And these are specifically Irish parish records.
When you say when the records were burnt, there's two things that go through my mind. One is the idea they might have been burnt on purpose at the actual parish church level. Thankfully, there isn't that much case of that taking place. There are a few examples, but there aren't too many. What I suspect you're talking about more is the destruction of the Public Record Office in 1922 and the obliteration of over half the parish registers of the Church of Ireland, the Episcopal Church, which was the established church. That obviously doesn't really reflect Catholic records, but I would still add what I've said before, is that a very large percentage of the Irish population weren't Catholic, so it does actually affect Irish genealogy hugely.
Okay. John Gibson is asking, are there some Irish dioceses or parishes still to be indexed?
There are some bits and pieces which still have to be completed. I think there's a bigger problem in the fact that the images we were dealing with from microfilm were often not very good. So it would be lovely to go back and re-image everything from scratch at some future point. That needs to happen. But there is about 3% of the parish registers for the Catholic Church in Ireland which were never captured in the first place at all on microfilm or otherwise. So there's still a bit of work still to be done there. But it's not huge. Most of it has been done.
Okay, moving from Ireland across to England, Ron Hillman would like to know, how do you go back further in England for Catholics in the 1700s?
Well, you hope, for starters, there are actual mission registers, because before the establishment of formal parishes, there were various missions that were operating right around the country, and the priests would have kept registers for that. Those mission registers survive in each diocese and are actually kept in their diocesan archives. But it's a bit hit and miss as to what does exist and what doesn't. Not surprisingly, they survive better for the cities. In London, for example, the embassies of various Catholic continental powers had open parishes that could continue to operate. So an awful lot of the Catholics who were living in London itself would attend those embassies, the churches attached to those embassies, because there was no legal issue and certainly wasn't going to be problematic. Outside of the cities, the best places to look is up in the north. The north of England had such a larger Catholic community, it was much, much more difficult for the state to try and impose its authority and try and shut it down. So it did what it did in Ireland. It sort of tolerated it, reluctantly tolerated it, and the records survived better there.
Okay, thanks, Brian. A question in from Christine Rowland. Christine has a problem because she's found two baptisms for her relative. One is in Galway in 1848, and it's the 19th of August 1848, and the other is for the same name with the same parents, and it's for the 19th of August 1847. So any help on what the issue might be there?
Were they both in the same? If they're both in the same parish? Well, there's a couple of different issues could be going on here. I've recently discovered, and it's been brought to my attention by my wife, Fiona Fitzsimons, who's a genealogical expert, she's told me that, in fact, when children were ill in earlier times, they could be brought to be baptized again, because amongst the rural population there was a belief that there was some the actual process of baptism could help bring on a cure. And you often see that with very small babies. They can actually be baptized 2 or 3 times over the course of the space of 2 or 3 weeks if they're very ill. You could be looking at a situation where it was a sickly child, and the anniversary of their baptism, they were baptized again in the efforts of bringing them forward. That says an awful lot more about attitudes of a time than anything else. But that's one reason why that might be the case. It's too early for them to have been, we have a common problem in Ireland where parents don't register a child's official birth with the Civil Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages. They don't do it soon enough because they're supposed to do it within 6 months of a child's birth. And so you often find a baptism which is more than, it's quite different from the official date of birth on a birth cert. And that's because they've lied about the date of birth of their birth cert, so they don't actually fall foul of the rules, and they haven't actually broken the law by registering it too late. But that's different in this case because they're both baptisms. So I suspect it's probably a local custom brought forward by the fact that the child wasn't well.
Thank you, Brian. Kelly Haslam has asked us a question. It seems like there are a lot of different types of Catholic records. Is there one type that is particularly good to start with for Irish relatives?
Well, the most important sources of baptism and marriages. They're without doubt the most important. And in fact, there's actually not that much of the other types of records that I talked about. They tend to be very hit and miss as to what survives and what locations. So really focus your attention on baptisms and marriages, births and marriages, really, for your research.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left on this, guys, so I'll run through 1 or 2 more questions before we finish up. Morris Pierce has said that he noticed that Armagh baptisms for Maher Felt stopped in the 1870s. Are they likely to be brought up to 1917 soon?
That's a bigger question. I think that really going further forward in time with images of the Catholic records will require a major imaging project to take place in Ireland to go and get them. And I don't see that happening any day soon. I hope it does. It's possible that the church themselves will start doing some of this work. It's possible the National Library will be allowed to do some of this work. It's possible that we might be able to do this work for them. But it's not a cheap process. It's quite a big job. And it would be great if it was done. But so the simple answer is I don't know.
Thank you, Brian. I am seeing a lot of questions coming in for specific areas, so places in England and places in America and Canada as well. I think the one blanket answer to all of those questions is if we haven't mentioned it in this, it means we're probably not in a position to yet, but we are actively still going out to talk to all of the Catholic archdioceses to try and get the collection as big as we possibly can. So as soon as we have an agreement with any of them and we are allowed to actually announce it publicly, you'll be the first to hear. So keep an eye on your Findmypast Fridays and things like that. So that kind of answers all of the questions regarding specific archdioceses. Probably time for just one more, Brian, before we finish. And Mary Mather is asking, how are nuns recorded in the records, if they are at all?
And nuns, generally speaking, aren't recorded in the sort of registers that I'm talking about here. The only record there will be of nuns will be the records kept by the various convents themselves, and the material that I've been talking about very much is of the sacramental registers that are kept by every parish, and they're really of baptisms, marriages, burials, catechisms, confirmations, and so on. So if you want to get records about nuns themselves, you really should get in touch with their individual orders. They're very good at keeping records, so you can actually have some great success in what you might find.
Lovely. I'm going to push it here and squeeze one more question in, and these are specifically about our Philadelphia records, and it's come in from Valerie Kramer, and Valerie's asking about the German Catholic records in Philadelphia. Are they in a similar format to the records in Latin and English, or are there things that can help her to actually read the German records?
They're in a similar format in the main. I should say that most of the records are in Latin, irrespective of the religion the ethnicity of the group that came in. But they're usually quite formulaic and they're quite straightforward to read. for that reason, even if they are in German. And we've, again, made sure that we've got alternate forenames to try and help you make sense of them.
Lovely. Thank you, Brian. So that's it, everyone. That's it for our webinar today. And remember, on your screen is the offer code for the 50% off a 1-month world subscription. So if you want to take advantage of the Catholic Heritage Archive and access the records from the US and the UK and Ireland, you can take advantage of that now, and that expires on the 24th of April. So you have a few days to use it up. So that's it. Do stay tuned to all of our other webinars. They'll be announced in our emails, so keep an eye out for those, and on our Facebook page and Twitter. And we will join you next time. So thank you very much for joining us today. Bye-bye.